Well, welcome back to our final session in CB Matrix Youth Ministry to Youth module. In this session, we are going to kind of put together everything we've been talking about and wrap it up for you. Now, before we do that, though, we've had a lot of good discussion about small groups and mentoring, and there are just a couple of things I want to say. There's a lot more I could get into details about how to do small groups and mentoring with your youth. One question that popped up, or one idea that popped up, was that one of the great benefits about youth ministry done in the small group format is that it frees you from just having youth group at one time. And so, like I said, we've transitioned as a church from having a central youth worship time to small groups. And so most of our groups started on Wednesday night, all at the same time in different parts of the building. But now more and more, we have small groups that pop up at different times during the week in different locations and stuff like that. And so one thing about youth ministry done in small groups is that it really frees you to have small groups, to have youth that meet at all sorts of different times. And so I know during sports season, during football season maybe, it's hard to get a lot of students in at night because they practice, and so you can have a small group that meets at a different time that's better for them. And so that's one of the things that small groups give you. They give you that advantage of building around the participants' schedules. Or so you can even decide, hey, we're going to meet on Saturday mornings. It's going to give us a small group, but we can ensure that those students are still part of our youth group. You know, if you only say the youth group is on Wednesdays from 7 to 8:30, and if a student works or has a school commitment on Wednesday from 7 to 8:30, then they're kind of out of luck. And so small groups really enable students to be connected to the youth ministry at different times. The other thing I want to say about that is, another question that came up was, what happens in mentoring relationships and small group relationships? At what point, if students share certain information, when do you talk to a parent about that? You know, if students bring up certain issues, when do you talk to other church leaders about it? And so there's a couple things to say about that. One is, if what you're talking about is an abuse situation, so like if you suspect that a student in your small group is being abused, or if they tell you that that is happening, then certainly right away you need to report that. I hope that every church needs to have a youth safety policy and a kids safety policy that clearly outlines how to handle abuse, if you sense that abuse has happened or you believe it's happened. And like, we are real clear with our leaders that if they are told that a student has been abused, or if they sense that they need to report that immediately to their church leaders, who will then report it to the appropriate authorities. And if they suspect that, they need to do the right thing and to report it right away. Let's say if a student comes to you and says that they've been smoking pot, or they've been sleeping with their boyfriend or girlfriend, or whatever it is. Again, our policy is that we are confidential to a point with students or with anybody that we meet with. Certainly, if a student tells us something they're struggling with or something, we're not just going to go tell everybody about it. But if a student is involved in an activity that certainly is illegal, or is a sinful habit that they're not able to deal with, we first of all encourage them to go and talk to their parents directly about it. And then if they refuse to do that, we'll follow up with their parents. And so those are just some guidelines that you'd want to adopt, or you'd want to put together for your church when it comes to safety and confidentiality. Because in these small groups mentoring relationships, you're going to have some very serious conversations with students, and you got to know how to handle that. And so those are just a couple things that came up in our discussion. Now, what I want to do in this session together is I want to talk about empowering youth to lead, which is sort of what we've been building up to, right? We've been building up to this idea that we want to see our students become disciple makers. And so in order to do that, we're going to need to empower them to be leaders. And we're going to talk about how to do that, how to empower students at your church, in your ministries, and also how to train youth leaders, because that's going to be a big part of empowerment. And so what we really want to do is, again, we don't want to just see our students honor God and trust in Jesus, we certainly want to see that, but we want to see that taken to the next level and see them be disciple makers and become leaders and become servants in the next generation. So I want to, again, in our last session, I want to give you one more opening thought, ask you a question. Do you remember the first time that your parents let you stay home by yourself? Do you remember the first time your parents let you stay home by yourself? Or do you remember the first time your parents let you take their car out by yourself? You know, the first time, maybe mom or dad never let you do that. I don't know. Maybe dad never let you take his Corvette out. I don't know, if your dad had a Corvette, right? Do you remember that? Or maybe if you don't remember that, it was a long time ago, do you remember the first time that, like at work, that they let you give the sales pitch to the client? You know, do you remember? What I'm trying to get at is thinking of a time when you were really empowered, maybe especially when you were young, when you were really empowered to do something. I was thinking about the first time I was asked to do communion at my church when I was in college. And you were supposed to, when it was communion time, you were going to get up and you were going to share like a little 60-second devotional thought and then kind of proceed into communion. And I was so honored to lead communion. I was so excited about it. I studied communion and I looked at all sorts of different Bible verses that I wanted to talk about. And so I got up there and I read from Ezekiel and the New Covenant and the New Heart. And I was just like, I probably turned my 60-second devotional into a 15-minute devotional at a certain point. And I was just, I think all they wanted me to do was to read 1 Corinthians 11. But I was so excited, right? I felt so empowered. And I was just so excited in that moment. And, you know, when you are empowered to do something in life, it's exciting, right? When your parents empower you, that's exciting. It's honoring. When your boss empowers you, when you're empowered at school, that's exciting. When your coach empowers you on the team to be a leader on your team, to, you know, become a captain on your team, that's exciting. It's honoring. It's motivating. And when students are empowered at their church, it's motivating. Not just students, anybody. I mean, when you empower people, at our church real recently, we've been training up leaders in our church to preach, they're not teaching pastors, they're not paid pastors at our church, and they're preaching, and we've been empowering them to do that, and I think it's excited them, and I think it's been exciting for our church to see them lead and be empowered to lead. And so as we think about youth, we need to think about how can we empower our students to be leaders? How can we give them opportunities to make disciples in the church? We must give them opportunities to lead. If we say, okay, yes, we believe the Great Commission is not just for adults, it's for students too, then we have to give our students opportunities to lead, opportunities to learn how to make disciples. And so as we think about this, the first point that we need to think about is that we need to start letting your youth lead now. Okay, in your church, figure out ways to let your youth lead right now. And so if we're going to do that, we need to ask ourselves a question. Everyone is a leader, whether you're a youth leader or not. If you're just a church leader, do you believe that youth can make disciples? You know, do you believe that students can really begin to make disciples? Maybe not all on their own, but do you think that students can really do this? And I hope that the answer is yes. I hope that that's true and that you give them opportunities to do so. I go back to the words of 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. So if you still are in Timothy, you can flip over to 1 Timothy 4:12, open that in your Bible app. And this is a verse that if you're a youth leader or you work with young adults or college students should really resonate with you. It says, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." Now again, this is written by the Apostle Paul to Timothy, his spiritual son, the person he's mentored, he's raised up. And he says to Timothy, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. Now, we're not entirely sure how old Timothy was. Some say late 20s, some say mid-30s. There's kind of a range of opinion on that. But Timothy was considered a young man. For the role that he had, he was considered a young man. And yet, how is he charged? He's charged to set an example for other Christians. He's told to set an example in speech, in the things that he says, in the words that he says, in the words that he preaches, but even just the way he uses his mouth. Set an example with your words. Set an example with your conduct, with your actions. Show the rest of the church how to act in a way that is honoring to God, that's pleasing to God. He's told to set an example in love, love being such a primary characteristic of a Christian, and something that a lot of times, hopefully the longer you grow as a Christian, the longer you're a Christian, the more you'll grow in love. And yet if you're a church leader, you're supposed to set an example in loving one another, He tells Timothy in faith and trusting in God and believing in God, even at a young age, to having really powerful faith. And then he ends with purity. He says, set an example to the rest of the church. Again, that's what he's telling Timothy. Set an example to the rest of the church in terms of purity, in terms of sexual purity, which obviously is such a struggle for so many people, and certainly people who are young. And yet Paul believed that Timothy, guided by the Holy Spirit, could do this, could set an example. And I think what this passage teaches me, it teaches me a lot of things, but one of the things that it teaches me is that students empowered by the Holy Spirit are able to set the example in their church. They're really able to set the example. Just like Paul commanded Timothy, our students can begin to set an example in our church. That age isn't an excuse to get out of doing ministry. That you can't say, well, once, again, like we've joked before, but, once they're 18, then they'll be disciple makers, or once they're 19, that age is not the problem. That really we should challenge our students to do the work of making disciples, to do the work of trusting God and believing in his promises and living a life that's honoring to him. And so allow your students to set the example in your church. Allow them to do that. And I think that's just something that we need to reconcile, that we have to give them opportunities, that, students, they're probably not going to go grab opportunities for themselves. And so we need to give them opportunities in our churches, in our ministries, to help them to lead, to help them to grow. So give them opportunities. Give them opportunities to serve in your church. And just think about all your serving teams. I mean, I'd imagine that really at all we call them serving teams at our church, but, different ministry teams at your church. I would bet just about any of those teams, youth could serve on those teams. I mean, youth can serve in kids' church. That's a great place. If you have students who are ready to take on some responsibility at church, have them serve in the kids' church ministry. Have them serve, whether it's being an assistant, I mean, however you structure your kids' church ministry. You can have them serve in nursery. You can have them serve as assistants in classes. And it's not only gives them an opportunity to lead, but it's also a blessing to your kids' church, because we all need more kids' church people all the time, right? I know that. I know that's true just about every church. We can always use more kids' church help. And that's a great place for our students to lead, to be leaders. At our church, we do a lot to recruit from our youth group to serve in kids' church. And my kids, because all my kids are still in kids' church, and they love it. They love when teenagers are their teachers, and they think it's so cool, to have them in there and to hang on them and to try and punch them. That's what my little boys do, and so they like to mess around with the youth, the students in there, and that's a great opportunity. Again, and when our students serve in kids' church, what are they doing? They're modeling. They're setting an example for the other members of the church. They're setting an example with their conduct. They're saying, hey, we are here at church not for ourselves. One little thing that we'd like to say at church is Sunday is for serving. Sunday is for serving. We have Saturday night services, so that little phrase doesn't work as well as it used to, but Sunday is for serving. And what we mean by that is church isn't for you. It's not about you. It's about honoring God and helping other people. And so we try and instill that in our youth group. We had so much going on with our youth group, and we just really felt like we needed to focus on small groups, to the point that we did have like Sunday morning Bible studies for our youth, but we got rid of them. And we decided that if you're going to attend for a couple services and you're part of our youth group, then we want you to attend a service and serve for another service. And we weren't going to do a Bible study for that second hour, but we want to empower our students to serve. So your students can serve in kids ministry. They can serve on worship teams. We've seen our students be leaders on worship teams, and I don't know what it is, but our church just gets so excited when they see young people up there as singers, young people up there playing instruments. It is just catalytic for our church. It fires them up. And there's some growing pains with that. I know that some of our youth guitarists, we've had to turn down their volume for a few months, and kind of keep them, they've been just an encouragement by being up on the stage. But eventually they really grow into their role. And you have young people leading your church in worship, and it's a blessing. We've gotten worship leaders out of, we've trained our worship leaders. They started off as playing instruments or singing as part of the youth group, and now they're worship leaders at our church. You can look for other opportunities for kids to serve in technical ministries. We've have students that run sound for us, that run our slides and our media and our video for us, ushering, greeting. Like I said, there may not be any area in your church where your youth can't participate on some level. They can't serve in some level. Empower them to lead. Say, I believe in 1 Timothy 4, and so I'm going to let you set an example and put that out there for them and challenge them to do that. Encourage families to serve together. That's one thing that we've tried to do over the years, is to encourage mom and dad to serve with their student, and that's just another thing to do together. We have a lot of kids' church classes where mom or dad and one of their or two of their junior high school age students serve together, and they can participate in that ministry together. And then mom and dad are even doing some discipling in the midst of ministry. It's all just working together. So all these are all working together, and it's really exciting and it's really catalytic. And of course, what we're really building to, when we say this, is raising up youth to be leaders in their small group. Because we want to unleash them to actually make disciples, to invite their friends to small group, but more than that, to lead their friends to Christ and to help their friends begin to obey all that Jesus commanded, or to help their younger siblings do, or other people that God will bring into their lives. And so allow your students to take on leadership opportunities within small groups and within the youth group. We've experimented in a lot of different ways with this. We've had high school students lead junior high groups with the help of adults. We've had high school students lead high school groups with the help of adults, and it's really incredible to see what happens when you empower students, when you train them and empower them to do that. Now, as we talk about students making disciples, there might be some objections to that, and I assume that all of us think like, well, we'd all love to see students become disciple makers, but there's some real difficulties in that, I admit, and maybe there's even some objections. Maybe even have some objections. And I listed 3 possible objections that we might have. And the first objection is, but they don't know enough, right? They don't know enough. I mean, they're kids. What do they know, right? Like they're students. They don't know how to make disciples. This is sort of like the knowledge, the idea that you don't know enough to make disciples. And this idea, this objection could be raised against adults. Maybe you have adults, maybe if in a different module I'd be up here saying that you would want to have everybody in your church become a disciple maker, and you might say, well, not everyone in my church knows enough to make disciples. It's kind of the same argument. And so let's think about that for a minute. What I like to think about is, well, what do you really need to know in order to make a disciple? The first person who really helped me think through this was another book. It was a book by a pastor named Steve Morrell. He's also a pastor in the Philippines, in Manila, in the same church as Joey Bonifacio, and he has a wonderful book called Wiki Church. I'd encourage you to check out Wiki Church. It's a fun read. And in Wiki Church, Steve Morrell talks about Acts chapter 9 and the conversion of Paul. And so if you're familiar with Acts chapter 9, you probably remember, Paul, he's Saul at that time. He's a Pharisee. And at the beginning of Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, what's he doing? He's arresting Christians, right? He's trying to figure out ways to capture more Christians and throw them in jail. And he had been there at the stoning of Stephen, approving of it. And that's kind of what he's up to, verses 1 and 2. He's just Saul. He's set against God. He is trying to destroy Christianity. And then what happens? Verse 3. He's on the road, and what happens? Jesus shows up, right? The bright light, Jesus shows up. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul comes to faith He trusts in Jesus. He not only comes to faith, but he's commissioned to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and he's blinded, and all that stuff happens where the scales are lifted from his eyes. And so that's verses 3 through 19. In verses 3 through 19, almost right away, Saul he goes from being an enemy of the gospel to becoming a Christian. And then look what happens in the second half of verse 19. If you have your Bibles open, you're scanning it. What happens in the second half of verse 19? Paul starts preaching. It says, like, within a few days, it says, in verses 19 through 20, it says that after a few days of being a Christian, Paul starts preaching. Did you catch that? He became a Christian. Now, maybe you think, like, well, yeah, he's a Pharisee. He knew a lot. But again, he was like arresting Christians and trying to rub them out. And then in a matter of a few days, not only does he become a Christian, but now he's preaching and he's trying to convince people that Jesus is the Christ. I mean, how many of us are, like, after a person's been a Christian for a week, you're like, so are you ready to preach on Sunday? You know, like, we're going through Genesis 12 this week, so please come and be ready to preach at 9, 10:30, and noon for us. You know, that's not how we tend to think of things, but that's what it says about Paul, that in a few days he was ready to preach. And so what do I mean by all this? You don't need to know a lot to make disciples. That's really the principle here. You don't need to know a lot. One thing we like to say is that you only need to be one step ahead of a person, or you only need to be one chapter ahead of a person. And so if you are a Christian, guess what? You can begin to make a disciple. So if a student is a Christian, they can begin to make a disciple. How? They can invite a friend to church. They can invite a friend to youth group. I mean, that's the beginnings of discipleship, right? Come and see who Jesus is. Come and figure out, come and understand who God is. And then as a student begins to learn a little bit about God and begins to have foundations developed in their life, and they know more about God and they know more about Jesus, they can pass that on to their friend. And so you don't need to, I'm firmly convinced that you don't need to know a lot in order to start making disciples. You just need to be one step ahead of them. Now, you need to be careful, because if you're only one step ahead, then you got to make sure the person you're discipling doesn't jump you, right? And then they start discipling you. But really what I'm trying to say here is that students, their knowledge is not the problem. Their knowledge is not the problem. You don't need to know a lot in order to begin making disciples. You can start right away, and then because what we've seen is as you make disciples, you're motivated to learn more. You're motivated to understand more and grow more. So that's the first objection. The second objection is this: but they aren't mature yet. They aren't mature yet. How can the young people disciple? They're not mature. They don't know how to drive yet. You know, how can they really go and make disciples? This is such an important task. And again, what I would say is we need to flip our understanding of maturity a little bit. You see, we tend to think that maturity happens through information. Like, if I just know more stuff, then I'll become mature. Like, if I just know more stuff, if I have more theology, more understanding of the Bible, you know, that'll make me mature, and then I'll be ready to minister. I have to become mature. So this is the myth. We call it the maturity myth. But the idea is, if I need to know a lot of stuff, and that will make me mature, and then I can go and minister to people. Then I can go and make disciples. But if you read Ephesians 4:11 through 13, it sort of flips this around. And in Ephesians 4:11 through 13, it says that Jesus has appointed prophets and apostles and pastors and teachers and evangelists, and he's appointed those people to do what? To equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. And then it goes on to say in verse 13 that as we're doing this, as we're doing the work of the ministry, we do this until the point where we reach full maturity in Christ. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. But what it says there in verses 12 and 13 is that we start to do, the people of God, not just the pastors and leaders and the elders, but the people of God do the work of ministry, and by doing the work of ministry, we become mature. You see, that's what we teach at our church, that you become mature by helping other people, by doing the work of ministry, by making disciples. That's what matures you. You don't get mature by just listening to a lot of sermons and reading a lot of books. As helpful and as wonderful as those things are, you get mature by doing the work of ministry. And so what I would say is, if someone says, well, you know, a student's not mature enough yet, I'd say that's right. That's because they need to start doing ministry. They need to start leading. They need to start serving. They need to start learning how to talk to the kids in kids' church about the gospel. You know, they need to learn how to explain the gospel to a first grader, and then a second grader, and so on and so forth. And you know, they need to start doing ministry, and that will make them mature, and then they'll have the tools for making disciples. One other objection that you might have, even youth pastors have told me, is that they aren't reliable enough. That teenagers are simply not reliable enough. And at this one, I'm tempted to say you're right. That's true. They're not reliable enough. But you know, I know a lot of adults that I would say maybe weren't really as reliable as I hoped. You know, I tried to set them out on the path of making disciples in ministry, and they didn't live up to everything they said they were going to do. And you know, if you think, well, our teenagers aren't reliable, that they sometimes don't show up, they sometimes don't do things they say they're going to do. Again, first of all, adults were like this. But I would also just even go back to what it says there in 1 Timothy 4:12, that we need to encourage them to set the example. That we don't want to create a culture where we just say, you know, teenagers, they slack off, they goof around, they can't really do the work of ministry. Instead, let's recognize that if these students are Christians, that means they have the Holy Spirit inside of them. They have God's Holy Spirit inside of them, they have God's presence inside of them, and that's the same Spirit who's in you and me, and as a result, we could expect that Spirit to be at work in their life. We could expect the Spirit of God to be at work in their life, and we can challenge them with 1 Timothy 4:12. We can say, let's get to the point, student leaders, where you set the example in our church in speech and conduct and love and faith and purity. Instead of saying, well, you know, teenagers aren't reliable and that's the end of the story, why not challenge them? Why not say we believe in you to do more and be more than society says, or that even the regular people in the church say? So I really believe that youth can make disciples. I'm sure there's other objections. I'm sure there's other reasons why we might say that it's hard to have youth be the disciple makers in your church. But I hope you understand that part of that is just because we're looking at things incorrectly. We're thinking, we have the wrong idea of what you need to know in order to make disciples. You know, we think you have to be an expert on systematic theology, or that you have to know the church's doctrinal statement inside and out, and that's not really what the Bible says. The Bible says just go and start making disciples, inviting people to Jesus. And that's why we need coaches too. You know, when I say that we want to unleash students to go and make disciples, they need mentors in their lives. They need people in their lives who are going to help them and train them to do this, because they're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes in making disciples. And so they need someone to come alongside them and to help them. Now, once we've understood that a lot of our common myths, the common myths that we hold, or the common objections that we have about youth's ministering and just people in general ministering in our church are faulty, then we need to understand this, that as church leaders, we have a responsibility, I believe, to invest in our students as the future of the church. Invest in our students as the future of the church. Your students in your church are the future of your church. They are your future church leaders. Now, maybe that's a little scary as you think of some of them right now. You're like, wow, they're going to be our future church leaders. But I hope that isn't, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity that the students in your youth group, the kids in your kids' church, the college students who are graduating right now, they are the future of your church. They are future leaders. They are future pastors. They're future missionaries. Now, I hope you have a big vision for your youth. I have a big vision for our youth. I hope that, like, my future boss at this church is running around in kids' church somewhere, you know, like that one day the future leader of our church that I'm a part of is in our kids' church, and that'll be great to be like, I remember when you were in second grade and you were getting in trouble in kids' church, and you know they're our future. One of the reasons that youth ministry and kids ministry is so important is because they're the future leaders of our churches. They're our future missionaries. They're our future college missionaries, campus missionaries, ministers, you know, whatever you would want to call them. That's what's found in our youth group. And if you grab hold of your youth now, it can reap tremendous rewards in the future. So this one church, I've referenced to their pastors and to the books they've written in Manila. The name of the church is called Victory Church, and they are an incredible church in the Metro Manila in the Philippines, and they are a church currently, I just visited them in March, and I think they have 18 campuses, and they have like 80,000 people that attend over 18 campuses. And so it's just this, I mean, I can't even, it's hard to even think of what those numbers mean. They're just so incredible. That's just so amazing to see the work that God has done through their church, and just the thousands and thousands of people that have come to faith in Christ through that church. But what's so cool is, while I was there in March, I was meeting with a lot of their pastors and a lot of their leaders, and just about every pastor on their staff grew up at Victory or became a Christian at Victory. And they became a Christian as a high school student, as a college student, or now the church has been around long enough that some of these young pastors actually grew up there. And just to think that all of these leaders, I mean, these tremendous leaders and preachers and disciple makers and small group leaders and missionaries, when they send out missionaries all over the world, all over Asia, I think they have churches in almost every country in Asia now. A lot of them came through their church, their youth ministry, their college ministry, came to faith through those things. And so when I say that, we should invest in our youth because they're the future of their church, I'm not just saying that because that sounds like a thing you should say, but really practically, those students in our churches can make such a dramatic impact in the future. So I'd encourage you to disciple them, to equip them. Give your students meaningful ministry. If you're the senior leader of the church, make sure you do this. But whatever level of leadership you have, even if you're not the senior leader of your church, you can give students meaningful ministries in the places and the spheres where you have influence. And, pass on the values of your church to your youth. Don't just assume that the values of your church are going to be passed on from the parents to the kids. Pass those on to your students. Tell your students this is what matters. One of the things that happened again when I took over our youth group, we had done a lot. I'm not trying to just sort of say that our youth group was terrible or anything, because there were a lot of great things that had happened in our youth group. But a lot of our values were messed up. The values of the church didn't really match the values of the youth group. And so I had to kind of go to a lot of our students, even who are leaders, and say, hey, this thing that you value so much, we like it, but it's not like our core value. It's not disciple making, because that's our core value. And so we had to unlearn all these things. But if you can raise up students who understand the core values of your church, think of what that's going to do to the future of your church. I mean, imagine what will happen if you raise up a generation of students who, from the age of 16, 17, or younger, started making disciples. I mean, how many disciples will they have made by the time they're 30 or 50, or by the time they, go to heaven and be with Jesus? I mean, so many, right? And they're just going to think that this is what the Christian life is like. It's about making disciples. And so if you invest in your students now, if you invest into them as disciple makers, we'll reap a tremendous reward in the future. But to do this, we need to train our youth leaders well. We need to train our youth leaders well. One of the key things that's going to make this whole thing work is to train our youth leaders well. And this should be a top priority, to train our youth small group leaders, our youth mentors, our student leaders. Training them, empowering them to lead is a key part of what we need to do in our church. You see, one of the things that we need to do even is just to demystify youth ministry a little bit. We talked about this in our discussion. Just as we talked about the kinds of people that could serve in youth ministry, sometimes people might think, well, I got to be cool or young to serve youth. I got to be a certain age, or I got to have a certain coolness factor. I have to spend a certain amount on clothes or something like that. But none of that's true, because youth are not looking for people who are faking it. That is the one thing they don't want. They don't want people who fake it. They are looking for authenticity. They're looking for people who authentically care about them. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter, what you look like or how you dress. They want people who really care about them, because they don't have a lot of that in their life. And so I know it's intimidating to even think about working with youth, but I would say that what is needed most of all are people who are authentic, who authentically love and care for them. And so put that out there for the leadership of for your church as you think about raising up youth leaders, and make training a priority. I think the best way to train, because we're so small group centered and mentoring centered, the best way to do it is to train your people on some very foundational principles, the kinds of things that we've discussed today, and some other specific issues that deal with youth ministry that we haven't had time to get into today. And then insert them into a youth small group. Insert them in there not as a leader, but just as an assistant. to be mentored by another youth leader. I mean, that's the ideal way this happens, is that if you have a new adult who says, I want to work with youth, you put them in a small group that already has another adult leader, and then that adult leader mentors this new leader and raises them up until they're ready to lead their own group. And so, it's not a quick process, but it's the best process, because we really want people to understand what mentoring and discipleship is all about. And you can't just sort of teach that through a lecture or through a book. You have to experience it. And so I think that on-the-job training is the best. Now, I'll just say again, just like our curriculum, we have all of our youth training available online if you want to take a look at it and see what we do. If you'd like to use any of it, it's at pursuegod.org/youth ministry. So I think that URL is in your notes, and you can check that out and you can see what we have. We've got adult leader training, we've got student leader training. If you have students who are ready to take on leadership in small groups, you can take them through that. We've got all of our sample documents, safety documents, leadership covenant, all that kind of nuts and bolts stuff that's really necessary. You can check that out if you're interested. And again, there's other good training online. There's some good books and stuff. But the point is investing in your youth leaders and training them. And as we kind of bring all this together, I think one of the things that we're saying when we talk about empowering our youth to lead is we need to help your youth feel like part of the church. You need to help your youth group feel like it's part of the church. Sometimes youth groups feel like fringe things at churches. It's like we have the church, and the church goes one direction, and the church does one thing, and then we have our youth group, and who knows what our youth group does? They do a lot of broomball. I don't know what they do. They mess up, they trash our bathrooms, and they take our chairs and knock them out of order. Whatever the things that people think about when they think about youth ministry. If you're a church leader, try and bring your youth group into the life of the church, into the heartbeat of the church, and try and align the values of your youth ministry with the values of your church, and the values not just of the youth ministry, but any team at your church. And so I have a few ideas for how you can do that here, things that we've done at our church at Alpine, things I've learned from other pastors. And one is, I would say, if you're a church leader, certainly if you're the senior leader, visit your youth group from time to time. Just show up. If you have, depending on how it's arranged, maybe you'll decide that we're going to have all our small groups meet at our building at a certain time, or you're going to start off with 1 or 2 small groups to meet in one house, or however you do that. Just show up from time to time, and just kind of let them know that, hey, I know you exist, and I know that this youth group is here, and I care about it, and just that I support you all. That can just be really meaningful. I know, like I've said, we have our 5 youth groups within our church, and so every one of our campuses at Alpine, every one of our locations has a lead pastor, or like a campus pastor. And what we found is that the more the campus pastor shows up and is involved in the youth ministry, just meaning being aware, being present, being able to talk to the leaders, the more success that youth ministry tends to have. And so I would just encourage you, just be present, just show up and check in with your youth group from time to time. And as the second point says there, meet with the youth leaders. Meet with them. Just see how they're doing, see what they think, see what they're struggling with. Often, if you have a youth ministry that is small group based, a lot of the struggles of the youth ministry are going to be the same as the struggles as your small group leaders. And you could probably work a lot of issues out together. And so as the leader, or as one of the leaders of your church, go to their meetings, encourage them. And let me just say, I'm not here to talk about kids' church ministry, but do that for kids' church too. Show up to your kids' church, walk through your kids' church area during church, and encourage those people, encourage those leaders. Come to their leader meetings from time to time and encourage them. And one of the great things that you could do, if you just really want to bless your kids' church and your youth ministry at your church, is just recruit for them. Even if you're a preacher and you get on the stage, recruit for them, or in your sphere of influence, recruit for them, and just share that vision. Share that vision for what it's like to invest in the lives of our kids and what it's like to invest in the lives of our students, and just share that vision with them and inspire your church and recruit leaders for those ministries. Don't leave them to do all the recruitment themselves, but help them out in that way. And you're going to make them feel like they're part of the team, feel like they're part of the church. The third thing there, invite youth leaders to overall church leadership meetings. This is something that it took us a long time to start doing. I don't know why, but we kind of figured out, like, hey, we shouldn't just let the youth just meet among themselves all the time, but even your adult youth leaders and even your student leaders, you know, invite them to come to church leadership meetings. If you have big meetings where you talk about the vision for the next year of your church, or if you have some sort of leaders rally, you know, get the youth in there. Make sure that they feel like they're connected to the church. Because again, I don't think that youth groups, I don't think that youth pastors or the volunteers who lead the youth groups at a lot of our churches, I don't think they're sitting there thinking, how can we make how can we distance ourselves from the rest of the church? You know, that's not what they're trying to do. They're not sitting there thinking, how can I make the pastor's life miserable? You know, that's really, how can I do that? No, they just need a little help. They need a little guidance. They need a little support. And so I think even inviting them to your leadership meetings is just a wonderful testimony that you value them. They're part of the team. You're all working together. Number 4 here, teach a class for your students. Teach a class for them. Maybe you didn't realize this, but your students, they like to hear from the leaders of their church. They like to hear from their pastors. They like to hear from their elders. You might feel like, oh, I'm not cool enough to teach my students, but you know what? Again, they just want you to be authentic. And if you just show them that you love them and you care about them, they're going to listen to you. And so I'd encourage you just to teach a class for your students. Our students get a kick out of when one of the pastors teaches a class or does the video for them or something. They appreciate it. It's a different voice. It's a new voice. It's the voice, one of the voices maybe they hear on Sundays, but now they're hearing it directly to them. So teach a class for your students. And number 5 there, even some of you, I challenge, I hope somebody here who's listening to this, number 5, lead a youth small group for a season. You know, maybe to get this youth ministry DNA into your church, maybe you, one of the leaders of your church, needs to just lead a youth small group for a season, for a time. I know one of the pastors in our area, his youth group at his church had pretty much died out. Kind of a smaller church, and they just really weren't going anywhere. And he kind of saw that reality that they were going to start losing these students. And he didn't want to lose them. He wanted to equip them, and he wanted to empower them. And he's the only one that had that vision for that. And so even though he was the senior leader of the church, he put some people into other leadership positions in the church so that he could go and lead his youth ministry and lead a youth small group for a while. And he did that because he understood how important that was, how important those students were to the future of their church. And, you know, maybe some of us just need to say, you know what, God is calling me to lead some younger people for a while. Like maybe I'm the one that can make a difference in the lives of these junior high students or high school students or college students, because they're so important. If we lose our students, then we're losing the future of our church, and we have to start over. We have to start from scratch. And so, you know, there's a lot that you can do to help your youth feel like part of the church, but again, I think of your church, think of your context, and think of how can you empower students to lead. I'd encourage you even to do this. Just make a list. You know, I talk through certain certain ministries in your church, but even make a list of your ministries and say, well, what couldn't a youth do at our church? You know, and maybe you come up with a couple. Maybe they're not ready to preach. You know, and maybe they're not ready to lead the worship or whatever. Maybe you don't trust them to count money. I don't know. You know, whatever. You don't want to tempt them beyond what they can bear or something. But you know, list out the ministries of your church and just say, where couldn't a youth lead? And then start going to them and encouraging them to lead. Encourage families to lead together. If you know students at your church, just go directly and challenge them. Challenge them to lead. Empower them to lead. And then, most of all, empower them to make disciples. You see, what we need to do is we need to take our students who are on board, who are on our side, and who understand our values, and we need to help them understand this discipleship-making process so that they can reproduce it in their own lives. See, part of the problem is our students graduate and they get done with youth ministry, and they don't know what's just happened to them. They're like, I just had 6 great years, but I have no idea what was done to me. Like, I know I had an awesome youth group, but I don't understand the process. But if we spell out and say, hey, what we're trying to do is this. We want you to become a disciple of Jesus so that you can make other disciples of Jesus. That's what we're doing in your life, so that you will do it in the lives of others. And you just give them that vision, and then you just expect them to begin to live that out, and you walk with them, you help them, you coach them through the ups and the downs. That's what the vision is. That's what my vision is for our youth ministry, to see youth who really understand trusting in Jesus, following God, and making disciples. And I just want to, again, go back to that vision. I want you to think about your church right now. Think about your ministry that you lead. Think about the church plant that you want to plant, and think about how it would be transformed if you utilize the youth of your church. If you recognize that the students in your church can become disciple makers, think about how in a generation it would transform your church, or it could transform your community, to unleash, when they go to college, just a group of wild students who are passionate about making disciples. Think how that could transform your church. Think how it could transform your community. Think how it could lead to a flood of new churches, of new missionaries, and new work for God. All that comes through student ministry. So I'd encourage you, don't forget your students. God may never call you to be a youth pastor. God may never call you to do youth ministry, but don't forget your students. Be influential in the work, in the lives of your students, and in some way help produce this culture where you have these kinds of students. And so that's our module. That's our Ministering to Youth module, and that's our 4 sessions, and there's a lot more we could say, but I hope you have a lot of food for thought on how to apply this to your youth and to your college students at your church. Now, I also understand this is the end of the CB Matrix, this first cycle of classes, and so I just want to congratulate. I think there's like 21 people who are graduating today in all the different groups and cohorts, and I just want to say that is so encouraging. I know we have 5 people, I think, from our own church who are graduating today, and I'm just really impressed with the work that you've put in, the dedication you've put in, and I'm just excited to see the fruit that our church is gonna get from this. And I just want to encourage you. All the things that you've learned, I know you've learned so much. I've gone through school and seminary, and you learn so much. And the key is to not just get a lot of knowledge, but to put it into practice. And so I just encourage you, to challenge you to not only put this module into practice, modules you've heard, and to do the work of ministry and disciple making to the glory of God, trusting Him with the results, trusting Him with the fruit, but honoring Him in this way. So just congratulations on all that you've done and all that you've put into it over this time. And again, I'll just say for myself, don't forget your youth. Don't forget your junior high school students. Don't forget your college students. In a very real way, they are your future. And as you think of pouring, I'm sure as you come to the end of these classes, you think of all that's been poured into you by instructors and by trainers and by cohort leaders. Now, part of the action for you is how you can pour this into other people. And I really believe that certainly your family and your students and the young people, the young adults in your church is a great place to start, as well as everyone else in your church. And I'm excited to see and to hear about what God is going to do in our churches and our communities, that God will do just beyond what we could ever imagine, as it says in Ephesians. So thank you for joining me, and that's the end of this session.